The Africa Roundtable, a podcast by the Global Perspectives Initiative.
For his uncompromising and compassionate penetration of the effects of colonialism and the fates of the refugees in the gulf between cultures and continents. Last year, Abdulrazak Gurnah received the Nobel Prize in Literature. Gurnah is not just an author, he is Professor Emeritus of English and Post-Colonial Literature of the University of Kent. A few days ago, on his reading trip to Germany, he presented the new edition of his book, By the Sea. My colleague Christina Mhundwa met him to talk to him about racism, flight, migration and identity, among other things, but also about his current view of Ukraine. So, welcome to the Africa Roundtable, the podcast by GPI.
Hello, everybody, and it's really great to have you on this GPI podcast. Today, we're in conversation with the novelist and writer Abdulrazak Gurnah. He is the 2021 Nobel Prize Literature Award winner. It is great to be in conversation with you. You have a number of novels. You've written many a chapter. But the chapter I'm interested in right now is the bit in your life when you've just arrived in England. And you say here that the anguish of a stranger's life, prolonged poverty, and alienation meant that you began to do a different kind of writing. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure, that was from the Nobel lecture.
That's right.
And I was referring there to the kind of writing that I used to do, if you like, before coming to England, which was mostly things to please myself and to please friends, kind of school review, that sort of thing, you know. None of it was intended really to be much more than fun. But I think it was during that period that you've just introduced with those remarks where I started to write really for myself. You know how it is sometimes, writing is a useful way of disentangling things for yourself, particularly when you're young and self-pitying, you know, where you can sit there, it's a gloomy day, it's raining out there, and you feel low as hell, and you sit there and start putting thoughts down onto a piece of paper, like that. So it's like that kind of thing, just writing things down as a way of kind of working them out. And it just went on, because it was proving quite useful as a way of trying to understand what it was that I was living through and what I had left behind and all this kind of thing. So that's what I mean when I started to do a different kind of writing. It was really reflecting more on things that were happening to me.
And what was happening to you?
Well, what was happening most of all, I suppose, is being a stranger, being in a place where you, on your own, more or less. When I say more or less, it's because my brother and I were there together. But in actual practice, we were both on our own, if you see what I mean. And actually knowing very little about the place where we were, and not having very little money, and I guess also having left our homes in quite such a reckless and drastic way. And again, you don't realize that. And I see some of these young people doing these dangerous things away from their homes, taking such risks with their lives. And I do honestly feel for them, not only because of the risks they're taking, but I think, gosh, do you know what you've left behind? Because very often you can't get that back. What I mean by that is it's not that you can't return, but there is a kind of bind, you see, about taking life decisions like that, which means that you can't return empty-handed. You take a risk, you risk your life, you're saying, I'm going to do something. And until you've done something, you're more or less, as it were, forced to be a migrant. And in that time, you're probably, like I said, poor, homesick, miserable, disliked, by the people you're living amongst. It's that kind of experience that I suppose I'm meaning it was like, coming to understand that, coming to live with that. So it's different with when people migrate as a family, say. Yeah. I know it's hard because the parents have children to worry about, but when you migrate as a young person, first, you're stupid because you don't have experience of life. Secondly, you probably don't have any skills to sell, as it were, to get you a job. And then thirdly, there's so much to understand, there's so much to forget, rather to come to learn to forget. So that's what it was. It's just kind of learning to grow up, as it were.
Yeah. Thank you so much for pointing that out. In fact, that is one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about, the migration that you were referring to. You were talking about the young people that risk their lives crossing the Mediterranean. I imagine you're talking about those young people who think that that journey is worth taking. Many of them sadly haven't made it. But you talk about your lived experience. You said being disliked. There is this big conversation in Europe right now about migration. And it appears that it's controversial because people don't want people who are different coming to Europe, right? They don't want people who worship differently, people who look different, who have different cultures. What do you make of that, right? Here you are today, a celebrated author, and everybody wants to highlight the fact that you've been living in the United Kingdom. But in truth, many Europeans don't like the idea of welcoming young people like yourself. And that hasn't changed.
No, it hasn't changed. No, it hasn't changed. Of course, it has changed in some way. I mean, the intensity is different. Who the targets of this dislike are also moves on, changes. But the hostility or the dislike and so on is, of course, there for the very simple reason that we know about is to do with racism, is to do with people that as it were, the narrative of Europeanness has already constructed as inferior or as in some way or another troublesome. When these people come here, they will do this, they will do that, they will do that. And even if lived experience shows us not so, in the sense that people work with these people, their children go to school with children of these people, they can see the big heart surgeon or this one or that one, still in the end, this is what I mean by target. Still in the end, it seems, Afghans, we don't want them. Syrians, we don't want them. This is what I mean by target changes. But this sense of the strangers that are coming amongst our midst will somehow lead to a kind of deterioration of our way of life. What does this mean? It means it's a sort of meanness. Not everybody, of course, not everybody at all, but a sort of meanness which is also kind of constantly stoked by groups of communities within these societies, but also by the press in many cases, who see it as a cheap and easy way of generating noise, as well. And politicians who also see it as a way of capitalizing on a certain disaffection. It says people like this, people like that. Well, I mean, I guess it's a war, it's a battle, not a war. It's a battle that continues. So the conversations that we are having now would have been different conversations, say, in the 1950s, where there was absolutely no awareness that there is anything to be apologetic about or to say there is a problem or something like that. And we move on. So we just keep pressing on and just hope that things will get clearer as we go along.
Yeah. Often, as I've witnessed it, the narrative around migration is so negative. What would be the positive side, right? Or what is the positive side to the migration story that people are missing out on, do you think?
Well, you just have to look at the way so many of these people who have been allowed, shall we say, or who have managed to make their way into these societies, fleeing war and violence and whatever it is that's made them leave their homes in the first place, to see how they have made lives for themselves, the resilience with which. So this is not a matter of persuading the receiving communities that, hey, give them a chance, although it is that as well, but it's also a way of kind of saying how admirable, to see how human beings can, pick themselves up and get themselves organized and make lives. It's not new. I mean, migration is just as old as the sort of human existence, as it were, and people are moving around all over the place. And if you think of the way in which Europeans in the last 150 to 100 years have left Europe to go and, in some cases, displace people from their worlds, but in any case, go there and make their lives and so on. It seems really mean that the handful, in comparison, of people who are coming to Europe to work or live seem to be so frightening. They're going to ruin our culture, the end of the white race and all this sort of business. Well, I guess this is what people who are prosperous imagine when they think of the poor or the rabble. They see them as threatening their comfortable lives. But really, it's just that perception.
We're having this conversation at a time where a war is raging in Europe. I'm making reference to the Russian invasion into Ukraine. And it has been interesting to observe how not only it's been covered from a media's perspective, but just how Ukrainian refugees have received different treatment, so to say. Countries like Poland, we've seen Poles coming out to open their homes to Ukrainian refugees, the very same Poles who wouldn't extend that warm welcome to people who were coming in from the Middle East, who were stuck at the border between Belarus and Poland not very long ago.
They still are.
Some people are still there, you're quite right. What do you make of that? Why is there a difference between a person suffering that has white skin and a person suffering that has darker skin?
Well, it's racism. That's what it is. And so it's no surprise, of course, to see it at all. It's sad because you don't want to say anything. I don't want to say anything against the assistance and the welcome that the Ukrainian refugees are receiving. It's a perfectly human response to do that. But of course, it's completely wrong that those people from Afghanistan and from Syria and wherever else, that they are not received with the same humanity. But, that's how things are. That's how people are. These they see as their neighbors and brothers, and I suppose in some cases there might even be families that are kind of stranded. So it's not surprising that they should feel a warmth and a sympathy for them. What is inhumane is the response of the Polish authorities, who, from the pictures that we saw, are literally pushing people away with great violence, sometimes children, sometimes the mothers of children. And they're still there on the other side of the border. But the fact that the differences in the way these people are being treated is, I don't think, to me, it's not surprising. It is to do with this extended way of making a narrative of criminality about, non-European asylum seekers and refugees, say in the United Kingdom, for example, which is kind of being toned down a little bit. But at one point, the Home Minister was talking about the people crossing the Channel as criminals, as people breaking the law, when in fact the reason they're forced to do this is because of the various barriers that the state has created to prevent them making that journey in any other way. So there is no orderly or legal way in which people can request permission and asylum. So they do that.
You write a lot about identity. You explore that as a theme in your work. You sort of alluded to it, when you said, there might be this familiarity between people. Does that have a factor in all of this? The fact that culture and identity is still a big part of how we relate as human beings, and so it's easier for a Polish person perhaps to accommodate a Ukrainian than they could somebody from North Africa?
Well, yeah, of course, inevitably so. This is just a human thing. It cannot be gainsaid by saying, everybody deserves and so on, because human beings respond to what they're familiar with to some extent. But we have to differentiate between, I think, what we can expect of sort of unrequested, shall we say, sympathy for strangers, and what authorities can do. What if individuals wish to donate part of their home to somebody else? This is one thing. But we're talking here about, say, the Polish police and the Polish state, or the British government and so on. I think that's a different issue. That is an issue of a certain responsibility to be hospitable to people in trouble, because it's a human responsibility.
New perspectives, insights, and global analysis. Subscribe to the free newsletter by GPI, the Global Perspectives Initiative. globalperspectivesinitiative.org.
While we're on the theme of identity, I wondered what you identify as.
I don't even think about what I identify as. I can tell you without any quibbles, as it were, I'm from Zanzibar and I live in the United Kingdom. This, to me, is enough identity. Then if you want me to say so, I'll say yes. I'm an African-born person who lives in the United Kingdom, but I'm also quite happy to live in the United Kingdom. It's my home in a certain way, because my other home has not stopped being my home. So they're both my homes. And this, I think, I love this possibility of possessing two homes without any trouble. But I don't call those identities, you see. I mean, I think of this word identity as, to some extent, as a kind of forcing the issue about loyalty in a way, which is which I don't think is always helpful, because as far as I see it, I can be both, and I'm very happy to do so, and it's no problem to me. But if it bothers somebody else, then they can decide what identities I am. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't have any problems or doubts about it. I'm a Zanzibari who lives in the UK.
Right. The other theme, perhaps the main theme of your work is post-colonialism. And that's a very interesting conversation. I spoke to recently we had a podcast conversation with Nanjala Nyabola. You might be familiar with her. She's the Kenyan author. And she actually made the point to say, are we really living in the post-colonial era? Are we really there yet? But the GPI also recently released a study talking to a lot of voices on the continent, and the sentiment there was that there are still traces of colonialism on the continent, in the relationship between people on the continent and former colonial powers. Just what is your experience? What is your perception about this big, broad theme, post-colonialism? Are we uhuru just yet?
Well, I think to speak about post-colonial as some description of a present reality, in other words, the end of colonialism. Colonialism is over, post, whatever. I think that's probably not, in my view, the best understanding of this term, post-colonial. Because clearly the outcomes, consequences of colonialism are with us in great detail not only the examples we've been talking about, these are people who are refugees from wars that are Western wars really being fought in other locations. So you might see this as a new version of a kind of imperialism, which is not about territorial occupation, but it's about exerting power over other people and making them do what you want them to do for whatever reason. And you might also see rather that the consequences of colonialism are with us in terms of the sources of these conflicts, which are to do with what European reorganization of the world, if you like, maps, etc., making countries out of nothing, that this is their work to some extent. This is what they've bequeathed to the rest of the world. It seems to me a more profitable way of thinking about what this term means is, firstly, that it came into being as a way of constructing a curriculum, a way of constructing how do you speak about the history or the literatures, or indeed, as it happens, the anthropology, the social science of the world, in a way that allows us to cross kind of boundaries of region, boundaries of language, and to focus rather more on the experience of colonialism, which many parts of the world share. So it then actually allows you to put, let's say, an Indian writer alongside a writer from Samoa and see that they are, in fact, talking about things that have an overlap, without saying, oh, here's the Pacific, here's India, here's Africa, here's whatever. So it actually allows a certain kind of broadness about how we approach our knowledge of the world. This is, to me, is the most productive way of thinking what this term means. It would be untrue and rather, optimistic to say that it describes a condition of the world now after colonialism, because I don't think we're there yet. So I wouldn't, and also in any case, I think of it as a term that is provisional to the moment. It's useful to us now to use this term. If you don't like this term, give us another one, and we'll see how we get on with that. So let's not get sort of stuck, as it were, in fighting about whether we embrace this or whether we refuse it. If people don't want to embrace it, don't. Find another term that actually is more truthful about how we inquire into a knowledge of these places. What I don't think is always useful is to return to that model of area studies, which is to say Africa, Caribbean, whatever, so that people can only operate within a narrow area of study. Of course, they can still do that. I'm not saying people shouldn't do that. But what I do think that this idea of post-colonial gives us is the ability to cross these boundaries and to cross disciplines. So you can have kind of some degree of interdisciplinarity. So you can use literature, history, anthropology, social science in, as well, the same kind of inquiry that you might be making.
Just staying on the theme of post-colonialism, we're hearing a lot in recent years. It's coming into the conversation in Europe as you have this woke generation, a younger generation of Europeans calling out their authorities and basically rallying for the wrongs of the past to be righted. We're seeing that artifacts are being returned to the continent, and we're seeing commitments to that effect, right? The acknowledgement, it's more vocal. And what would be your message to Europeans who want to figure out this space of reconciling, of doing right by the people that were wronged? Are they going about it the right way? Is it enough to just say we're giving back artifacts, or we're opening the conversations, or we're paying sums of money? For example, the Germans in Namibia. Just your thoughts on that.
Well, I don't think that there is only one way of doing it. The important thing is to acknowledge that these artifacts, some of which are valuable both in a sacred sense as well as art, that these were looted artifacts. So to have that acknowledgement in the first place would be important, to understand that this was not just curiosity that brought these things back to European museums, but that they were actually deliberately taken from places by people who knew their worth, who knew that there would be some material reward, as it were, resulting from this. So to acknowledge that and to understand that what is apparently the civilization of the world held in big museums in Europe is actually a theft. That will be a very important thing. And there is no kind of half measures in this. It has to be understood. Then what is done about that is not so straightforward, because there could be different options, one of which is that some kind of reparation, a payment to say this is the proper, worth, as it were, cost, proper, this thing. One thing. The other thing is that many countries which are rich enough to do so can say, we want them back. And we do indeed have the facilities to look after them. One way of thinking about it, which I've heard people say, is that you steal something from a place, and then you say, no, we can't give it back to you because you don't know how to look after it, when in fact you are the one who actually took it from them in the first place when they were perfectly okay looking after it. So these are the kind of conversations that people who hold these things, but very protectively so, museums in particular, have to have with themselves as well as with their own states and with their own people. All we can be sure that they understand is that this is a theft. And then you have to see whether you can persuade people to part with them, because you can't raid the British Museum and say, right, we're taking this stuff away. Look how long the Greek government has been trying to get the Parthenon marbles back, at least a century, and the British government will not part with them. So it's not even just to do with African countries or Caribbean countries or whoever. They do it to each other as well. But I think the more there is a recognition, particularly, say something like the Benin bronzes, which are literally a result of a raid, a massacre, and then plunder. This is completely straightforward. Or the plunder of in Ethiopia, I can't remember exactly the name of Todorov's, I think, something like that, one of the emperors, and a General Napier or something like that. They knew what they were doing when they were taking away all these treasures. I mean, it was deliberate. I mean, these are straightforward cases. These are not cases of somebody trading with, some kind of grave digger who has been, digging stuff out of a pyramid or something like that. This is a British military force that goes into somebody else's country and home and steals the stuff and takes it home and sells it. These are clear, straightforward things. So I think the more there is an understanding of what this so-called civilization of the world being held in the Metropolitan Museum or the British Museum, what that is a result of, I think the nearer we will get to some kind of solution.
GPI focuses its work on, Germany's policy in Africa or towards Africa. A lot of that is about the relationship between this European powerhouse and the continent. And I just wondered, from everything that you were just saying now in terms of the attitude towards acknowledgement, how can that engagement be improved, seeing as you do have a former colonial power now looking to reset its relationship with the continent? How can that be done? And as people sit in Berlin, as they draft policy in terms of their future engagement with the continent, what do they need to keep in mind as they do that?
I think they're doing what needs to be done. There is a way in which these sorts of negotiations slightly humiliating in a way. You know, a very rich country, slightly humiliating in a way, because a very rich country comes and says, okay, here's so many millions. Is everything all right now? And in a way, what do? Do you say, well, actually, no, take your millions and go away? You don't really want that. What we want is an acknowledgement, a proper acknowledgement. Or do you say, well, all right, I'll take the millions? And I think, because you know you can do something with the millions, you say you take the millions. The question then really, is that enough? Is that enough to kind of square the deal? Is that enough to say, okay, now responsibilities are kind of properly shared? I don't think a responsible government or responsible German negotiators would want that. And I expect they don't. So what I think is the more fruitful way of doing it, which I think is what is going on, is to say, how can we continue this? How can we help you in some way? You know, okay, here's a few millions, but how can we continue this negotiation so that we keep giving in a way, or we keep advising, or whatever? The irresponsible way, I think, which is also happening probably in the UK, is firstly to say no to everything, to refuse to acknowledge anything, unless they're taken to court and forced into, like with the Mau Mau, for example, the detainees forced into some kind of admission that some restitution is necessary, or to make it so obviously pecuniary. Here you are. Here's the millions, case over. Now, that's not a helpful way of doing it, I don't think, because I think there is a responsibility. So the recognition has to be that a responsibility is acknowledged and that responsibility is ongoing, not just a one-off payment to say thank you, goodbye.
Christina Mhundwa spoke with Nobel Peace Prize in Literature laureate Abdulrazak Gurnah. His title, By the Sea, is out now. The entire GPR team thanks you for your interest, for listening, and wishes you all the best.
The Africa Roundtable. This podcast is a production of the Global Perspectives Initiative.